The morning sun cast long shadows through the shattered windows of Manila General Hospital as Lieutenant Michiko Tanaka carefully folded her last clean uniform. It was April 12, 1945, and the sounds of American artillery grew closer with each passing hour. The 24-year-old nurse from Hiroshima had been serving with the Imperial Army Medical Corps in the Philippines for 18 months, but nothing in her training had prepared her for the systematic destruction of Japanese forces that was now engulfing Manila. "Tanaka-san," whispered her colleague, Second Lieutenant Yuki Matsuda, as she peered through a crack in the hospital's reinforced wall. "American tanks are moving up Taft Avenue. Colonel Yamamoto says we must prepare for whatever comes next." Michiko pressed her uniform against her chest, feeling the coarse fabric that had become precious through scarcity. The cotton material, once white with the distinctive red cross of the medical service, was now stained with blood, dirt, and the smoke of burning buildings. Like everything else in the Japanese Empire's crumbling Pacific strongholds, medical supplies had become critically scarce. Nurses were expected to make a single uniform last for weeks, washing it by hand when water was available and soap could be found. "They told us stories at the medical academy," Michiko said quietly, her voice barely audible over the distant sound of Sherman tanks grinding through Manila's rubble-strewn streets. "About how the Americans treat prisoners. They said we would be forced to wear rags, sleep on bare ground, eat scraps like animals." The propaganda that had shaped Japanese expectations of American captivity painted a picture of deliberate cruelty and systematic degradation. Military instruction films had shown captured Japanese personnel forced to labor in filthy conditions, denied basic sanitary facilities, and subjected to medical experiments. For female prisoners, the warnings were even more dire. Sexual assault, forced labor, and deliberate humiliation were presented as standard American practice. In the hospital's basement, converted into a makeshift aid station and command post, Colonel Yamamoto gathered his remaining medical staff for what everyone understood might be their final briefing. The smell of carbolic acid and surgical alcohol mixed with the acrid smoke that drifted through the building's damaged ventilation system. 23 nurses, 6 doctors, and a handful of medical orderlies represented the last organized Japanese medical presence in Manila. "The situation is clear," Colonel Yamamoto announced, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he consulted a hand-drawn map of American positions. "General MacArthur's forces have surrounded the hospital. Resistance is no longer possible. We must decide whether to follow the path of honor or—" He paused, unable to complete the sentence that would acknowledge surrender as an option. For Japanese military personnel, surrender represented not just tactical defeat, but spiritual disgrace. The Bushido Code that governed military conduct demanded death before capture, and this expectation was particularly strong for medical personnel who had taken oaths to preserve life. The nurses faced an impossible choice between personal survival and cultural honor. Lieutenant Sachiko Hayashi, a 30-year-old nurse from Nagoya, who had volunteered for overseas service in 1943, stood near the basement's single functioning light bulb, reading from a letter she had received from her sister just months earlier. The rice paper crackled in the humid tropical air as she shared news from the home islands that painted an increasingly desperate picture. "Keiko writes that soap has disappeared from the stores completely," Sachiko reported, her voice hollow with the weight of accumulated bad news. "Families are making washing powder from wood ash and animal fat. She says even the wealthy can't find proper undergarments anymore. Everyone is using rags and old newspapers." The contrast between Japanese wartime privation and American material abundance would soon become shockingly apparent to the captured nurses. But in April 1945, they could only imagine conditions in American prisoner of war camps based on their own experience of scarcity. If Japan, the conquering power, could not provide basic necessities for its medical personnel, what could they expect from enemy captors? At 13:47 hours on April 12th, white flags appeared at Manila General Hospital's main entrance as the sound of American voices echoed through the building's corridors. Staff Sergeant William Murphy of the 1st Cavalry Division's medical detachment was among the first Americans to enter the hospital, his Thompson submachine gun at the ready as he searched for Japanese holdouts. "Jesus Christ," Murphy muttered as he surveyed the hospital's interior, noting the improvised medical facilities and obvious signs of prolonged privation. "Look at this place. They've been operating without proper supplies for months. The American medic's observation was more accurate than he realized. Japanese medical facilities in the Philippines had been operating under severe shortages since early 1944, when American submarine warfare and strategic bombing had effectively severed supply lines from the home islands. Basic medical supplies that American forces took for granted, sterile bandages, morphine, surgical instruments, had become precious commodities carefully rationed among Japanese medical personnel. Lieutenant Tanaka was hiding in a supply closet when American soldiers discovered her, clutching her medical bag and a small bundle containing her personal possessions. Through the wooden door, she could hear boots approaching and English voices discussing the hospital's condition. Her heart pounded as she remembered propaganda warnings about American treatment of captured Japanese women. "Ma'am," called Sergeant Murphy through the closet door, his voice surprisingly gentle. "We know you're in there. We're medical personnel, Army doctors and medics. You're safe now. Please come out so we can help you." The concept of enemy soldiers offering help rather than demanding surrender was so foreign to Tanaka's expectations that she initially assumed it was a trap. Japanese military doctrine emphasized that Americans viewed prisoners as subhuman and would exploit any sign of weakness or cooperation. The idea that American medical personnel might extend professional courtesy to enemy nurses was not mentioned in any training manual. When Tanaka finally emerged from the closet, her hands raised in surrender, she was surprised to see American soldiers wearing clean uniforms with clear medical insignia. Sergeant Murphy, despite being armed, made no threatening gestures and instead offered her a canteen of clean water, a commodity that had been strictly rationed in the Japanese-held hospital. "Are you injured?" Murphy asked, speaking slowly in the hope that basic English might be understood. "Do you need medical attention?" The question revealed a fundamental difference in American and Japanese approaches to prisoner treatment. While Japanese doctrine emphasized security and control over captured personnel, American military regulations required that prisoners receive the same medical care available to American forces. This distinction would prove crucial in shaping the experiences of captured Japanese nurses. Dr. James Morrison, commanding officer of the 1st Cavalry Division's medical unit, arrived at Manila General Hospital within hours of its capture to assess the situation and organize treatment for both American casualties and Japanese prisoners. The 42-year-old physician from Chicago had served in North Africa and Italy, but the condition of Japanese medical personnel in the Philippines shocked even his experienced eyes. For these nurses are suffering from malnutrition, exhaustion, and what appears to be chronic dehydration, Morrison reported to division headquarters via field telephone. Their uniforms are in tatters. They obviously haven't had access to proper sanitary facilities in months, and several show signs of untreated medical conditions. Morrison's assessment reflected American military policy that had evolved throughout the war based on lessons learned in previous conflicts. The U.S. War Department had determined that humane treatment of prisoners served both moral and practical purposes. Well-treated captives were more likely to provide useful intelligence, while adherence to Geneva Convention standards protected American prisoners in enemy hands. As evening approached on April 12th, the 23 captured Japanese nurses found themselves transported to a temporary holding facility established at the former Manila Hotel. The luxury resort, which had served as General MacArthur's headquarters before the war, had been converted into a processing center for Japanese prisoners of war, awaiting transportation to permanent camps. Lieutenant Tanaka, still clutching her medical bag, walked through the hotel's ornate lobby with growing confusion. The marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and elaborate furnishings seemed incompatible with her expectations of American prisoner-of-war facilities. More puzzling still was the behavior of American personnel, who directed the prisoners with firm but polite instructions rather than the brutal commands she had been led to expect. "This doesn't match what they told us," whispered Lieutenant Matsuda as they were assigned to a suite that had once housed wealthy tourists. "Where are the cages? The interrogation rooms? The places where they said Americans would humiliate us?" The disconnect between propaganda expectations and actual experience was becoming evident to all the captured nurses. Instead of deliberate degradation, they encountered systematic organization and what appeared to be genuine concern for their welfare. American military police who supervised their movement spoke in calm, professional tones and made obvious efforts to respect their dignity as medical personnel. Captain Helen Rodriguez, head nurse of the Army Medical Corps detachment assigned to prisoner processing, had been briefed on the special challenges of dealing with Japanese female prisoners. The 31-year-old nurse from San Antonio understood that cultural differences and propaganda conditioning would make the Japanese women suspicious of any American kindness. "These women expect us to treat them like animals," Rodriguez explained to her staff during the evening briefing. "They've been told that American soldiers are barbarians who show no respect for medical personnel or female prisoners. We need to demonstrate through actions, not words, that their expectations are wrong." Rodriguez's approach reflected a broader American policy of using prisoner treatment as a form of psychological warfare. Military intelligence had determined that well-treated Japanese prisoners often provided more useful information than those subjected to harsh interrogation, while humane conditions sometimes produced converts who could be used for propaganda purposes against the Japanese Empire. As night fell over Manila, the captured nurses found themselves facing their first evening in American custody. The suite they had been assigned contained 4 beds with clean sheets, a private bathroom with running water, and electric lighting that functioned reliably, luxuries that many had not experienced since leaving Japan 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Tanaka stood at the bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection in amazement. The fixture itself was remarkable, a large, clean mirror without cracks or water stains, but what truly shocked her was the array of toiletries arranged on the marble counter. Soap, shampoo, toothpaste, and what appeared to be feminine hygiene products had been provided by their American captors. "Look at this," she whispered to Matsuda, holding up a bar of ivory soap still in its wrapper. "It's real soap, not the ash and fat mixture we've been using, and there's so much of it." The abundance of basic necessities represented more than mere comfort. It challenged fundamental assumptions about American character and capabilities that had been central to Japanese war propaganda. If Americans could provide such luxury to enemy prisoners, what did that suggest about the resource disparities that were driving the Pacific War? Meanwhile, in the temporary command post established in the hotel's former ballroom, Colonel Morrison reviewed reports from medical personnel who had examined the Japanese prisoners. The assessments painted a picture of systematic deprivation that exceeded American intelligence estimates of conditions in Japanese-held territories. "Chronic malnutrition in all subjects," reported Major Sarah Williams, reading from her preliminary medical evaluations. "Evidence of vitamin deficiency diseases, untreated infections, and what appears to be prolonged sleep deprivation. Several nurses show signs of having worked continuously without adequate rest for weeks or possibly months." Morrison studied the medical data with growing understanding of why Japanese forces had fought with such desperation in the Philippines. Personnel operating under such severe privation would naturally assume that enemy treatment could only be worse, making surrender seem equivalent to choosing a slower, more humiliating death. "Recommend immediate implementation of standard POW medical protocols," Morrison wrote in his report to MacArthur's headquarters. "These personnel require rehabilitation before they can be considered physically or psychologically stable. Suggest treating their recovery as a demonstration of American capabilities for intelligence and propaganda purposes." The recommendation reflected American strategic thinking that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Military planners understood that the treatment of Japanese prisoners would eventually become known throughout the Pacific Theater, either through prisoner exchanges or post-war communications. Humane treatment served American interests by potentially reducing the fanatical resistance that had characterized Japanese military culture. As the first night of captivity progressed, the captured nurses experienced a series of small revelations that challenged their understanding of American military culture. Guards who checked on them every 2 hours spoke quietly to avoid disturbing sleep. Electric lighting remained available throughout the night for those who needed to use bathroom facilities. Most remarkably, no attempt was made to search personal possessions or confiscate medical equipment. Lieutenant Hayashi, the nurse from Nagoya, sat on her assigned bed writing in a small diary she had kept throughout her service in the Philippines. The fountain pen and rice paper had been carefully preserved through months of combat operations, representing her only remaining connection to the cultural refinement that had defined her pre-war life. April 12, 1945, she wrote in precise characters. First day as prisoner of American forces. Expected brutality and degradation based on military instruction. Instead found conditions superior to those we experienced as Japanese military personnel. Cannot understand American motivation for such treatment. Suspect deception or preparation for future cruelty. Hayashi's suspicion was understandable, given the propaganda she had absorbed, but it reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of American military culture and institutional values. The United States military had developed prisoner of war policies based on practical experience and legal obligations rather than ideological hatred, creating systems that emphasized rehabilitation over punishment. The contrast with Japanese treatment of prisoners was stark, though the captured nurses had no basis for comparison. American forces in the Pacific had documented numerous instances of Japanese brutality toward captured personnel, while Japanese military culture generally viewed surrender as dishonor that justified harsh treatment of those who chose captivity over death. Dr. Morrison, unable to sleep despite the late hour, walked through the Manila hotel reviewing the medical facilities that had been established for prisoner processing. The contrast between American abundance and Japanese scarcity was evident in every detail, from the well-stocked medical supplies to the clean linens that were changed daily as standard procedure. "Sir," reported Captain Rodriguez, finding the doctor in the former hotel restaurant that had been converted into a medical examination area, "the Japanese nurses seem confused by our treatment protocols. Several have asked through interpreters when the real imprisonment will begin. They appear to expect conditions to deteriorate once initial processing is complete." Morrison nodded thoughtfully, understanding the psychological challenges involved in treating prisoners who had been conditioned to expect brutality. The success of American prisoner policies depended not just on humane treatment, but on convincing captives that such treatment would continue throughout their imprisonment. "Schedule full medical examinations for all personnel tomorrow," Morrison ordered. "Include dental care, treatment for chronic conditions, and full nutritional assessment. I want these women restored to health as quickly as possible. Document everything. This may become an important case study in prisoner rehabilitation." The decision to provide comprehensive medical care to enemy prisoners reflected American military doctrine that viewed humane treatment as both a legal obligation and a strategic asset. Healthy prisoners were more cooperative, more likely to provide useful intelligence, and more effective as examples of American treatment for other potential captives. As dawn approached over Manila, the captured Japanese nurses faced their first morning in American custody with a mixture of confusion, gratitude, and lingering suspicion. The comfortable beds, clean facilities, and respectful treatment contradicted everything they had been taught about American character, creating cognitive dissonance that would take weeks to resolve. Lieutenant Tanaka stood at the suite's window, watching American soldiers begin their morning routines in the courtyard below. The men moved with purposeful efficiency, their uniforms clean and equipment well maintained. More significantly, she observed no evidence of the casual brutality toward prisoners that Japanese propaganda had led her to expect. The morning sun revealed a reality that would fundamentally challenge Japanese assumptions about their American captors and introduce the first of many surprises about the quality of life in American prisoner of war camps. The morning of April 13th began with what Lieutenant Tanaka would later describe as the most shocking moment of her captivity. Not an act of cruelty, but an act of unprecedented generosity. At 0700 hours, a young American corporal knocked politely on the door of the nurse's suite and announced through a Japanese-American translator that fresh uniforms were available for all prisoners. "Uniforms?" asked Lieutenant Matsuda, her voice filled with disbelief. "But we were captured yesterday. Why would they provide us with clothing?" Corporal James Nakamura, a Nisei soldier from California serving as translator, smiled patiently as he explained American prisoner of war policies. The 22-year-old soldier had experienced his own family's internment in American camps, giving him a unique perspective on the treatment of Japanese prisoners. "Ma'am, the Geneva Convention requires that prisoners be provided with adequate clothing and sanitary facilities," Nakamura explained in fluent Japanese. "The Army has standard procedures for prisoner care, that include fresh uniforms, daily laundry service, and necessary personal items. The concept of daily laundry service was so foreign to Japanese military experience that several nurses assumed there had been an error in translation. During their 18 months of service in the Philippines, they had become accustomed to wearing the same uniform for weeks at a time, washing it by hand when soap could be found and water was available for non-medical uses. When the uniforms arrived, delivered by cart-like room service at a luxury hotel, the Japanese nurses faced their first direct confrontation with American material abundance. Each woman received 2 complete sets of nurses' uniforms, freshly laundered and pressed, along with appropriate undergarments, socks, and comfortable shoes. More shocking still, they were informed that soiled uniforms would be collected each evening and replaced with clean ones the following morning. Lieutenant Hayashi held up one of the uniforms, examining the quality of the fabric and stitching with the trained eye of someone whose family had operated a textile business before the war. The cotton was soft and well woven, the seams straight and reinforced, the overall construction superior to anything she had worn during her military service. "This is better quality than our dress uniforms back home," she whispered to her colleagues. "How can they afford to provide such clothing to prisoners, and why would they choose to do so?" The question revealed the fundamental disconnect between Japanese and American approaches to prisoner treatment. Japanese military culture viewed captivity as shameful defeat that justified harsh conditions, while American policy emphasized rehabilitation and the demonstration of superior values through humane treatment. Captain Rodriguez supervised the uniform distribution with the efficiency of someone who had performed similar duties dozens of times. The process was routine for American medical personnel, but revolutionary for Japanese prisoners who had been conditioned to expect deliberate degradation and systematic humiliation. "Each prisoner will also receive a personal hygiene kit," Rodriguez announced through Corporal Nakamura. "This includes soap, shampoo, toothbrush, toothpaste, comb, and feminine hygiene products. Additional supplies will be provided weekly or as needed." The mention of feminine hygiene products created a moment of stunned silence among the Japanese nurses. Such items had been completely unavailable during their service in the Philippines, forcing them to rely on improvised solutions that were both uncomfortable and unsanitary. The casual American assumption that female prisoners deserved access to such necessities challenged their understanding of both enemy military culture and the realities of wartime resource allocation. Lieutenant Tanaka accepted her hygiene kit with trembling hands, opening the canvas bag to reveal an assortment of products that represented months or even years of accumulated scarcity. The soap was genuine Ivory brand, manufactured in American factories that continued to operate at full capacity despite the war. The toothpaste was Colgate, a luxury that had disappeared from Japanese stores years earlier. Most remarkably, the kit contained sanitary napkins of a quality and design that surpassed anything available in pre-war Japan. "They must be trying to soften us for interrogation," whispered Lieutenant Matsuda, though her voice lacked conviction. No army provides such luxuries to enemy prisoners without expecting something in return. But as the morning progressed, it became clear that American generosity extended beyond mere calculation. The nurses were provided with access to hot showers, the first many had experienced since leaving Japan, and given unlimited time to bathe and attend to personal hygiene that had been neglected during months of combat conditions. The shower facilities themselves represented a level of luxury that exceeded most Japanese military installations. Hot water was abundant, water pressure was adequate, and privacy was respected in ways that contradicted every propaganda warning about American treatment of female prisoners. Clean towels were provided for each bather, and soiled linens were immediately replaced without request or explanation. Dr. Morrison observed the rehabilitation process from his temporary office in the hotel's former business center, reviewing reports from medical personnel who were documenting the prisoners' response to improved conditions. The transformation was remarkable. Women who had appeared exhausted and demoralized just 24 hours earlier were showing signs of renewed energy and improved morale. "Sir," reported Captain Rodriguez, "the psychological effects of basic hygiene and clean clothing are more dramatic than anticipated. Several prisoners have commented that conditions exceed those they experienced as Japanese military personnel." Lieutenant Hayashi asked specifically whether this treatment will continue throughout their imprisonment. Morrison understood the strategic implications of the prisoner's observations. Japanese military personnel who experienced superior treatment in American captivity would naturally question the propaganda they had been fed about American character and capabilities. Such doubt could prove valuable for both intelligence gathering and post-war reconstruction of Japanese society. The midday meal provided another shock for the Japanese nurses, who were escorted to a dining facility that had been established in the hotel's former restaurant. The room retained its elegant decor, with white tablecloths, proper place settings, and service that resembled civilian dining rather than military feeding procedures. "Good afternoon, ladies," called Sergeant Murphy, who had been assigned to prisoner services duties. "Today's menu includes beef stew, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. Coffee, tea, and milk are available with meals." The menu represented more protein than most Japanese civilians had consumed in months, and far exceeded the rice and vegetable diet that had sustained the nurses during their final weeks in Manila. American Military Food Service, standardized across all theaters of operation, provided 3,200 calories per day with balanced nutrition that met peacetime health standards. Lieutenant Tanaka stared at her plate in amazement, struggling to comprehend the abundance before her. The beef stew contained recognizable chunks of meat, the mashed potatoes were made with real butter and milk, and the bread was white flour rather than the substitute grains that had become standard throughout the Japanese Empire. "How is this possible?" she asked Corporal Nakamura during the meal. "Japan cannot feed its own population adequately, yet America provides feast-quality meals to enemy prisoners. Where do they find such resources?" Nakamura's answer provided insight into American industrial capabilities that Japanese leadership had consistently underestimated. The United States was not only maintaining civilian food standards throughout the war, but was simultaneously feeding millions of military personnel and prisoners at nutrition levels that exceeded normal Japanese consumption even in peacetime. "America produces more food than it can consume," Nakamura explained simply. "The challenge is not scarcity but distribution. Providing adequate meals to prisoners is considered a basic obligation, not a luxury." The concept of food abundance was so foreign to Japanese wartime experience that several nurses initially refused portions of their meals, fearing that accepting American generosity might somehow compromise their dignity or loyalty to the emperor. Cultural conditioning that emphasized sacrifice and austerity as patriotic virtues made it difficult to accept comfort from enemy sources. Dr. Morrison dined with his medical staff in an adjacent room, discussing the challenges of treating prisoners whose expectations had been shaped by systematic misinformation about American character and capabilities. The rehabilitation process was as much psychological as physical, requiring careful attention to cultural sensitivities and individual responses to improved conditions. "These women have been conditioned to view kindness as weakness or deception," Morrison observed, cutting into his own portion of beef stew. "They're looking for hidden motives behind every courtesy, suspicious of generosity that doesn't fit their preconceptions about American character." Captain Rodriguez nodded, understanding the delicate balance required in prisoner rehabilitation. Too much comfort too quickly might seem suspicious, while maintaining harsh conditions would reinforce Japanese propaganda about American brutality. The goal was to demonstrate superior values through consistent, humane treatment that couldn't be dismissed as manipulation. As afternoon evolved into evening, the Japanese nurses faced another surprise: access to recreational activities and reading materials that had been provided for their entertainment and education. The hotel's former library had been stocked with books in Japanese, newspapers from neutral countries, and even some American magazines with articles about medical advances and nursing procedures. Lieutenant Hayashi discovered a copy of the American Journal of Nursing, dated March 1945, and spent hours studying articles about innovations in trauma care and surgical nursing. The technical sophistication described in the articles exceeded anything she had encountered in Japanese medical literature, suggesting American medical capabilities that far surpassed Japanese understanding. "Look at this," she said to her colleagues, pointing to photographs of American military hospitals. "Their field hospitals have equipment we only dreamed of having in Manila: X-ray machines, modern surgical instruments, unlimited supplies of everything we struggled to obtain. The revelation was part of a broader awakening to American industrial and technological superiority that would continue throughout their captivity. Japanese prisoners who had been told that America was a weak, materialistic nation were discovering evidence of productive capacity and technical innovation that dwarfed anything in their experience. As evening approached, the nurses prepared for their second night in American custody, with growing confusion about their situation. The comfortable accommodations, abundant food, and respectful treatment contradicted everything they had been taught about enemy behavior, creating cognitive dissonance that would require fundamental revision of their worldview. Lieutenant Tanaka wrote in her diary that night, using one of the fountain pens that had been provided in their stationery kits. April 13th, 1945. Second day of captivity continues to confound expectations. Americans provide luxuries we never enjoyed as Japanese military personnel. Cannot understand their motivation, beginning to question accuracy of information provided during military training. The questioning had only begun. In the days ahead, the captured nurses would discover that their initial experience of American abundance was not temporary generosity, but standard procedure that would continue throughout their imprisonment. A revelation that would fundamentally challenge their understanding of both American capabilities and Japanese propaganda. By their seventh day in American custody, the captured Japanese nurses had settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible during their final months in Manila. Each morning began with fresh uniforms delivered to their quarters, followed by breakfast that included meat, dairy products, and fresh fruit, luxuries that had disappeared from Japanese military rations years earlier. The systematic abundance of American prisoner of war facilities was beginning to undermine decades of propaganda about Western weakness and moral corruption. Lieutenant Tanaka stood in the hotel's former salon, which had been converted into a medical examination room where American doctors provided routine health care to all prisoners. Dr. Morrison himself was conducting her physical examination, speaking through Corporal Nakamura with the same professional courtesy he would show to American patients. "Your malnutrition is improving rapidly," Morrison observed, reviewing test results that documented her recovery from months of inadequate food. "Blood pressure is normalizing, vitamin deficiency symptoms are resolving, and you've gained 4 pounds since arrival. With continued proper nutrition, you should return to full health within a month." The concept of continued proper nutrition was what most startled the Japanese nurses. They had initially assumed that the abundant meals were temporary, either preparation for interrogation or a brief period of good treatment before conditions deteriorated to expected levels. Instead, each day brought the same generous portions, the same variety of foods, and the same assumption that adequate nutrition was a basic right rather than a privilege. Lieutenant Matsuda, who was receiving dental care from an American military dentist, experienced perhaps the greatest shock of cultural adjustment. Captain Robert Davis, a dentist from Philadelphia, was treating a tooth infection that had plagued her for months during the Manila siege, using modern equipment and techniques that exceeded anything available in Japanese military medicine. "This may be uncomfortable, but I'll use Novocaine to minimize pain," Davis explained through the translator, preparing to inject local anesthetic. "We'll have this cleared up in a few days with proper antibiotic treatment." The casual use of Novocaine and antibiotics for a prisoner's comfort contradicted everything Matsuda had been told about American medical ethics. Japanese military doctrine emphasized that enemies deserved minimal medical care, with pain relief considered an unnecessary luxury, even for their own personnel. The American assumption that all patients, including enemy prisoners, deserved pain-free treatment challenged fundamental assumptions about medical practice and human dignity. Meanwhile, in the former hotel ballroom that served as a common area, Lieutenant Hayashi was engaged in conversation with Second Lieutenant Mary Chen, a Chinese-American nurse who had volunteered to help with cultural orientation for the Japanese prisoners. The discussion, conducted in a mixture of English and Japanese, was revealing deep misunderstandings about American society that had shaped Japanese war propaganda. "You really have enough medical supplies for everyone?" Hayashi asked, gesturing toward the well-stocked medical station where prisoners could request aspirin, bandages, or other basic supplies without restriction. "Even for enemy prisoners who cannot contribute to your war effort." Chen smiled patiently, understanding that the question reflected genuine bewilderment rather than sarcasm. In America, we believe that medical care is a basic human right. The fact that you're a prisoner doesn't change your right to be healthy and comfortable. Besides, healthy prisoners are less likely to develop serious illnesses that could spread to others. The practical explanation made sense, but it contradicted Japanese military culture that viewed prisoners as having forfeited their rights through the shameful act of surrender. More significantly, it suggested a level of resource abundance that made such humanitarian considerations possible, a luxury that resource-poor Japan could not afford, even for its own personnel. Dr. Morrison reviewed weekly medical reports in his temporary office, documenting the remarkable transformation in his Japanese patients' health and psychological state. The improvement was measurable in medical terms: weight gain, improved blood pressure, resolution of deficiency diseases, but the psychological changes were equally dramatic. All subjects show significant improvement in general health metrics, Morrison dictated to his secretary. More interesting is the observable change in attitude toward American personnel and policies. Initial suspicion and hostility have given way to confused gratitude and, in some cases, genuine curiosity about American society and values. The attitude change was part of a broader pattern that American intelligence officers were documenting among Japanese prisoners throughout the Pacific. Contrary to expectations based on Japanese fanaticism earlier in the war, personnel who experienced humane treatment often became cooperative and even friendly toward their captors. Captain Rodriguez noticed this transformation during her daily medical rounds, when she distributed vitamins and monitored the nurses' recovery from months of malnutrition. The women who had initially viewed her with suspicion and fear were now greeting her with polite bows and expressions of gratitude that seemed genuine rather than calculated. "Good morning, Lieutenant Tanaka," Rodriguez said cheerfully, offering the daily vitamin supplement that was standard for all prisoners showing signs of nutritional deficiency. "How are you feeling today?" "Much better, thank you," Tanaka replied in careful English, having begun to study the language during her abundant free time. "The food is very good. My strength returns each day. I do not understand why you are so kind to prisoners." The question that had begun as suspicion was evolving into genuine curiosity about American motivations and values. Rodriguez had been briefed to expect such questions and to answer them honestly as part of the psychological rehabilitation process. "We believe that all people deserve to be treated with dignity, regardless of circumstances," Rodriguez explained. "You were serving your country as a nurse, helping wounded soldiers. That makes you a colleague, not just a prisoner. We respect medical personnel regardless of which uniform they wear." The concept of professional respect transcending national boundaries was foreign to Japanese military culture, which emphasized absolute loyalty to the emperor above all other considerations. The idea that American medical personnel might view their Japanese counterparts as colleagues rather than enemies challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare and human relationships. As weeks passed, the Japanese nurses began to explore the educational opportunities that were provided as part of American prisoner rehabilitation programs. The former hotel's business center had been stocked with textbooks on nursing procedures, medical advances, and even English language instruction materials that prisoners were encouraged to use during their free time. Lieutenant Hayashi became particularly absorbed in American nursing journals, studying techniques and technologies that were years ahead of anything she had encountered in Japanese medical education. The articles described surgical procedures, pharmaceutical treatments, and patient care standards that suggested American medical capabilities far beyond what Japanese intelligence had estimated. "Look at this article about blood transfusions," she said to her colleagues, pointing to detailed photographs of American blood bank procedures. "They can store blood safely for weeks, type it precisely for compatibility, and transport it anywhere in the world. We were still struggling to find enough bandages in Manila." The revelation was part of a broader awakening to American technological and industrial superiority that would fundamentally reshape the prisoners' understanding of the war's likely outcome. Women who had been told that Japan was winning were discovering evidence of American capabilities that made Japanese resistance seem futile. Corporal Nakamura, who had developed friendly relationships with several of the nurses during his translation duties, often found himself answering questions about American society that revealed the depth of misinformation in Japanese war propaganda. The conversations took place during meals, medical appointments, and informal moments that allowed for genuine cultural exchange. "Is it true that American women can become doctors and lawyers?" asked Lieutenant Matsuda during one such conversation. "Our instructors said that American women are treated as property, with no opportunity for professional advancement." Nakamura, whose own sister was studying medicine at the University of California, smiled at the irony of the question. "Not only can women become doctors and lawyers, but many of the medical officers treating you here are women. Captain Rodriguez has a degree from one of America's best nursing schools, and several of our military doctors are female physicians." The information challenged Japanese assumptions about American social structure that had been central to war propaganda. If American society offered greater opportunities for women than Japanese culture allowed, what did that suggest about other claims regarding American weakness and moral inferiority? As their second month of captivity began, the Japanese nurses faced a fundamental crisis of belief that extended far beyond questions of immediate treatment. The systematic generosity, professional respect, and genuine concern for their welfare that they encountered daily contradicted not just specific propaganda claims, but the entire ideological framework that had justified Japanese aggression. Lieutenant Tanaka wrote in her diary, using supplies that continued to be replenished without request. May 15, 1945, 2 months since capture, Americans continue to provide treatment superior to what we received as Japanese military personnel. Medical care excellent, food abundant, living conditions comfortable. Must conclude that information provided during military training was systematically false. If Americans are not the weak, cruel enemies we were taught to expect, what else might be untrue about this war? The question would soon extend beyond individual doubt to collective recognition that Japanese leadership had fundamentally misrepresented both American capabilities and the likely course of the Pacific War. The nurses who had expected rags in American camps were discovering that fresh uniforms were just the beginning of revelations that would reshape their understanding of the world. On August 6, 1945, Lieutenant Tanaka sat in the garden of the permanent prisoner of war facility near San Francisco, where the Japanese nurses had been transferred after their initial processing in Manila. The facility, located in a converted resort hotel in Marin County, offered views of the Pacific Ocean that reminded her of home, while providing living conditions that exceeded anything she had experienced during her nursing career in Japan. The morning newspaper, delivered daily to prisoners as part of American information policy, carried headlines that would forever change her understanding of the war. Atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Entire city destroyed. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes, not just from grief for her hometown, but from a growing comprehension of American technological capabilities that dwarfed everything she had witnessed during 4 months of captivity. "Hiroshima is gone," she whispered to Lieutenant Matsuda, who was reading the same article while sitting on a comfortable bench surrounded by rose bushes that were tended by prisoner volunteers. "My family, my neighborhood, everything I knew." The atomic bomb represented the ultimate revelation of American industrial and scientific superiority that had been gradually unveiled during their imprisonment. For months, the captured nurses had been discovering evidence of American capabilities in the abundance of their food, the quality of their medical care, the sophistication of their equipment. But the atomic bomb made abstract superiority terrifyingly concrete. Dr. Margaret Sullivan, the American psychiatrist assigned to provide counseling for Japanese prisoners, found Lieutenant Tanaka in the garden that afternoon, sitting quietly beside a fountain that had been installed by previous guests of the facility. Sullivan had been monitoring the psychological adjustment of the Japanese nurses since their arrival, documenting their gradual transition from suspicion to acceptance to active curiosity about American society. "I know this news about Hiroshima must be very difficult for you," Sullivan said gently, speaking through the facility's Japanese interpreter. "Would you like to talk about your feelings? Many prisoners find it helpful to discuss their emotions during traumatic events." The offer of psychological counseling represented another aspect of American prisoner treatment that contradicted Japanese expectations. The concept that enemy captives might need emotional support and that providing such support was an American military obligation challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between captors and prisoners. "Dr. Sullivan," Tanaka replied, using the English that she had been studying with increasing dedication, "I think I begin to understand why Japan cannot win this war. If you can destroy entire cities with single bombs while providing luxuries to enemy prisoners, then our leaders have led us into hopeless conflict." The observation reflected a broader awakening among Japanese prisoners who were beginning to comprehend the true scale of American capabilities. The comfortable conditions of their captivity were not temporary generosity, but evidence of resource abundance that made humanitarian treatment possible even during total war. Lieutenant Hayashi, who had become the informal leader among the captured nurses, was in the facility's library when news of the atomic bomb arrived. She was studying an American medical textbook on trauma surgery, part of her continuing education in techniques that were decades ahead of Japanese medical knowledge. The juxtaposition of peaceful learning and apocalyptic destruction created a cognitive dissonance that captured the entire experience of Japanese captivity. "We have been living in a dream," she announced to her colleagues during their evening meal in the facility's dining hall. The room, with its white tablecloths and full-service kitchen staff, provided restaurant-quality meals that many of the nurses admitted exceeded the food they had eaten before the war, when their families could still afford quality ingredients. "For months we have wondered why Americans treat us with such kindness. Now I understand. They can afford to be generous because they possess overwhelming superiority. The comfortable beds, the fresh uniforms, the abundant food, these are not special gifts to prisoners, but normal standards that reflect American wealth and capability." The realization was profound and troubling. If American society could provide luxury-level treatment to enemy prisoners while simultaneously developing weapons that could obliterate cities, what did that suggest about the relative strength of the Japanese Empire and its chances for survival? Major William Thompson, the American officer who commanded the prisoner of war facility, had been observing the psychological transformation of his Japanese charges with growing fascination. His daily reports to the War Department described changes in attitude and understanding that exceeded the expectations of American psychological warfare specialists. "Subject prisoners have progressed through predictable stages of adjustment," Thompson wrote in his monthly assessment. "Initial suspicion and hostility have given way to grateful acceptance, followed by active curiosity about American society and institutions. The atomic bomb announcement has accelerated this process, producing frank acknowledgement of American superiority and, in some cases, criticism of Japanese leadership. The criticism of Japanese leadership was perhaps the most significant development in the prisoners' psychological adjustment. Women who had been trained to revere the emperor and accept military authority without question were beginning to express anger at leaders who had led them into unwinnable conflict while providing false information about enemy capabilities. Lieutenant Matsuda, whose dental treatment had been completed with care and skill that exceeded anything available in Japan, was particularly vocal in her criticism of Japanese military medicine and the propaganda that had shaped their expectations of American treatment. "They told us Americans would let us die from treatable diseases," she said during a group discussion session that Dr. Sullivan conducted weekly as part of the rehabilitation program. "Instead, they provide better medical care than we received as Japanese military personnel. They told us we would be forced to wear rags and sleep on floors. Instead, our uniforms are changed daily, and our quarters are more comfortable than most Japanese civilian homes." The systematic contradictions between propaganda and reality were creating a fundamental crisis of faith in Japanese institutions and leadership. Nurses who had once proudly served the emperor were beginning to question not just specific military decisions, but the entire ideological framework that had justified Japanese aggression. As August progressed and news of Japan's surrender became inevitable, the captured nurses faced the prospect of repatriation with mixed emotions. They had adapted to American abundance and begun to appreciate freedoms and opportunities that were not available in their homeland, particularly for women in a rigidly hierarchical society. "What will we tell people when we return to Japan?" asked Lieutenant Tanaka during one of the evening discussions that had become common among the prisoners. "How can we explain that Americans treated us better than our own military commanders? How can we describe abundance when our families are starving?" The questions reflected a broader challenge facing all Japanese prisoners who had experienced humane treatment in American camps. Their testimonies about American generosity and capability would contradict years of government propaganda, potentially undermining the nationalist ideology that had sustained Japanese resistance. Dr. Sullivan documented these concerns in her psychological profiles, noting that many prisoners expressed anxiety about returning to a society where their experiences might be viewed as disloyal or treasonous. The cognitive dissonance created by humane treatment was producing long-term psychological effects that would extend far beyond the immediate war period. On August 15th, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender via radio broadcast, the captured nurses listened in the facility's common room with emotions that ranged from relief to apprehension. The comfortable chairs, air conditioning, and high-quality radio equipment that delivered the news exemplified the American abundance that had characterized their entire captivity experience. "The war is over," whispered Lieutenant Hayashi, though the words seemed inadequate to capture the magnitude of change that surrender would bring to Japanese society. "We will go home to a country that has been defeated by enemies we were taught to consider weak and inferior." The irony was not lost on any of the nurses. Their captivity had provided them with better living conditions, medical care, educational opportunities, and personal respect than they had experienced as Japanese military personnel. The rags they had expected in American camps had been replaced by daily fresh uniforms, but more importantly, the psychological degradation they had feared had been replaced by systematic rehabilitation that treated them as human beings worthy of dignity and care. Captain Rodriguez, who had supervised their medical care since Manila, visited each nurse individually before repatriation to discuss their health status and provide medical records for Japanese physicians. The conversations were emotional, as professional relationships had evolved into genuine friendships that transcended national boundaries. "I want to thank you for everything," Tanaka said to Rodriguez in English that had improved dramatically during her captivity. "You have shown me that enemies can be kind, that medical care is universal human right, that women can be respected professionals. These lessons will change how I practice nursing in Japan." Rodriguez smiled, understanding that the transformation she had observed went far beyond physical rehabilitation. "Remember what you've learned here about treating all patients with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or circumstances. That's the most important lesson any nurse can learn." As the repatriation ships prepared to depart San Francisco in September 1945, the Japanese nurses packed personal belongings that included gifts from American staff, medical textbooks, English dictionaries, photographs, and letters of recommendation that might help them find employment in post-war Japan. More importantly, they carried memories and experiences that would forever change their understanding of American character and capabilities. Lieutenant Tanaka stood on the ship's deck, watching the American coastline recede into the distance. In her suitcase were nursing uniforms that American authorities had provided for her return journey, clean, well-fitted, and of higher quality than anything she had owned before the war. They were symbolic of everything she had discovered about American abundance and generosity during 8 months of captivity. "We expected rags," she said to her colleagues as they sailed toward an uncertain future in defeated Japan. "Instead, we found that Americans change uniforms daily, provide abundant food even to enemies, and treat all patients with equal respect, regardless of nationality. We have learned that our leaders lied to us about many things, but perhaps the most important lesson is that former enemies can become friends when they meet as human beings rather than soldiers." The fresh uniforms in her suitcase would serve as tangible reminders of American generosity, but the deeper changes in her understanding of medical ethics, human dignity, and international relations would influence her nursing practice for the rest of her career. The captured nurses who had expected brutal treatment had discovered instead a model of humanitarian values that would reshape their approach to patient care in post-war Japan. The war was over, but the influence of American abundance and generosity would continue long after the last uniform was worn and discarded. The nurses who returned to Japan carried with them not just memories of comfortable captivity, but evidence that their former enemies possessed moral and material superiority that had made Japanese defeat inevitable from the beginning. If this incredible story of unexpected humanity and wartime moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring these powerful, untold stories to light. We specialize in revealing the human side of history, where preconceptions are shattered and enemies discover each other's humanity. These stories remind us that even in the darkest conflicts, compassion and dignity can prevail over hatred and propaganda. What surprised you most about this story? The daily fresh uniforms, the medical care that exceeded what these nurses received from their own military, or perhaps the psychological transformation that challenged everything they'd been taught about their American enemies? And here's something to think about. How might the post-war relationship between Japan and America have been different if prisoner treatment had followed the brutal patterns both sides expected? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing how these forgotten chapters of history resonate with you and what lessons they might hold for our world today.